I am the product of immigrants, but I'm the product of immigration, which emphasized the importance of fitting in and becoming part of the society you're in, rather than immigration, which has been encouraged to create its own subcultures which exist almost in a vacuum away from the wider host culture. And I think that that's a very important distinction, which has been a big problem during my life. I mean, I would say that the multiculturalism that Blair really introduced and championed, that's during the 90s when I was a teenager, has been responsible for a lot of the problems that we have today. The idea that we can encourage waves of immigration and tell them that they don't need to learn English or learn British manners or learn British culture or British ways of being, I think is incredibly problematic and has really been the foundation for a lot of the problems that we're experiencing today. But I don't think that it's too late. I do think that the great thing about mistakes is that you can learn from them. And if you're smart enough, you can turn them around and use them to your advantage in finding new ways through to try and solve problems.
When you described England or Britain there, I started thinking of Japan, because it's similar kind of the good manners and self-deprecating and submissive in that sense. And that might be part of the problem we've had. We've become so submissive. You talked of saying sorry so much that we've just dismissed our own culture in favor of others. I think of Ishiguro, who wrote The Remains of the Day. It's many people's favorite book. I think it's one of my favorite books. And he that about an English sort of country house. And it's all about Englishness and British norms and whatever. But he also wrote a very similar book. I can't remember what it's called, Floating something, about a Japanese old house that was very similar to that. But it seems like one key difference is that Japan takes absolute pride in its nationality, what it is. It sets up its borders. It doesn't really let people into its culture that easily. And so whereas we've just gone completely bananas with that.
Well, I remember when I first visited Japan, and actually I went back a few years later, I loved Japan. I was very impressed with certain things actually that I found they had in common with us. Queuing, for example. Yeah. There is that old idea that a British man finding himself on his own will make a queue of one. And the Japanese take it to new levels. I mean, you find on the stations, the train stations, you'll find on the platforms, lines drawn where to snake, but to get on the train. And I think there's also a great deal of respect and mannered behavior in Japan, which again, perhaps they take to an extreme even greater than ours. And I'm no expert in Japanese culture, but I did find it interesting that also, perhaps in common with Brits, there's traditionally seen as a level of repression, of keeping things in. And maybe that is at times a fault in British culture as well. But I think all of these things are interesting balances. So I would say when it comes to Britain, it's really important that we should be able to reclaim things that we're proud of. And I think that symbols of those things are very important because unlike some countries, we don't have, for example, a national day to unite behind. We don't have an Independence Day, for example, as they may do in the US or in Israel or places like that. We don't have Bastille Day. So maybe our flag, but as I said, our flag is often looked at disapprovingly outside of sporting events and sometimes royal events. Waving the flag is not really seen as the thing to do. So I think we could try to reclaim some of those things. And I would say the closest that we get is the royal family in a weird way. And that's perhaps what we have in place of what the Americans have with the flag. So the Americans can stand behind their flag, we can stand behind the royal family, and it's a uniter across levels of society, across classes. But even that is perhaps slightly symbolic of Britishness in that it is this aristocratic, historical, effectively non-meritocratic thing in essence, but we've transformed it into something which is symbolic of our history, our culture, our manners, our pomp and circumstance, our way of doing things. And I think that in that respect, the royal family has been very useful to our society. I went when Queen Elizabeth II died to report on the queue of people who were queuing up to see the coffin in Westminster Hall. And actually, I found it amazing. I've never seen anything like that in Britain. It was, to me, almost an encapsulation of the pride in being British. You saw a constant river of people flying past this coffin, held up on that purple catafalque, and it was just breathtaking to see how people had queued, some of them for 10 hours or more, to quietly walk past bow their heads, pay respect. And those people came from every part of British society. There were young and old. There were people in nurses' uniforms, religious Jews, Muslims. Every single type of person you see out on the streets in Great Britain was represented there and went past respectfully and bowed their heads to the late Queen. And I think there was something extraordinary about that. But I would like to say that I don't think that the royal family is enough for that. And I think that as we move on in our national lives, a look towards the historical, towards the royal, perhaps isn't enough. And we need a sense of pride in who we are today and a sense of pride in the things that we can and should lead the world in. And I think we need that because it's not enough to say that we're proud of diversity and tolerance of others when that very diversity and tolerance of intolerant others is so potentially damaging to our way of life, and not just ours, but across the whole of the West.
It's interesting that you venerate queuing so much, because all I can think when I think back to that day was Philip Schofield elbowing. Did you see him elbowing past anyone, sort of trying to get to the front? Do you remember that queue gate? Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby. I mean, that was a mountain.
I'm treading carefully because I didn't queue. I went in the same route as Philip Schofield.
So get out of here now.
I went in as a journalist, and as journalists, you were allowed, you registered to go and report on what was happening. So we didn't join the queue. We were ushered in a given time slot, but we stood in a special place. And the truth be told, I was there to observe the phenomenon of people paying their respect. I was very pleased to be able to be there. It was.
Did you see Beckham?
I didn't see Beckham, and I didn't see Schofield, but I also didn't pretend to be there and to have queued. So maybe that is what people maybe felt had happened. I don't know. But I do think that queuing is it's a funny one. It's like the saying sorry, queuing. These are sort of quintessentially British things. I mean, the idea of things not being cricket, or the idea of being fair, of waiting your turn, of being respectful to others, of opening doors for others, of letting people through first.
So yeah, the island culture, a lot of that, Helen Pluckrose was talking about this. I can't remember the exact terms she used, but the reason Japan and the UK have this is with these islands densely populated relative to other countries. So you show your courtesy by giving space and not being loud, and you know, on the train you don't make eye contact with people, which someone from America, where there's so much space, might consider rude. And in the States, it's the opposite. Because there's so much space, people feel a bit solitary and you know, cordoned off from people, and so they will go, "Howdy, partner," and get sort of in your space, which we would consider rude, and they would consider polite. So maybe that's how it formed.